Hi, I'm Javier Nonis, tech lead at Globant Enterprise AI, and today we're going to build a multi-agent conversational flow for multiple channels. In the lab, we have several tools to create and orchestrate agents. In this session, we're going to talk specifically about flows. Flows allow us to create conversational user interfaces where we can orchestrate the execution of different agents and RAGs through predefined routes. Flows also offers built-in integration with various channels like Microsoft, Teams, and Slack. The same flow can be published on different channels, and we can also define specific routes for each channel if needed. To orchestrate a conversation with multiple agents, we're going to use the following pattern. This pattern uses an orchestrator agent that identifies the right route to continue the conversation, where each user message is sent to the appropriate agent to provide a response. In our example, we're going to create a multi-agent flow capable of answering questions about Globant Enterprise AI and collecting suggestions and feedback from users. To create this flow, we'll need an agent to orchestrate the conversation, a RAG assistant configured with a FAQ document about Globant Enterprise AI, an agent to collect feedback and suggestions, and finally, an agent to provide responses when user messages are outside the scope of our example. Let's start by creating the orchestrator agent. We need an agent that determines the right path for the conversation. In our example, the paths will be FAQ, which will send the user's message to the FAQ RAG, feedback, which will send the user's message to the feedback agent, and unknown, which will send the user's message to the fallback agent. Let's ask Iris to create this agent for us. Let's take a look at the prompt. We specify a name for the agent, a purpose, indicate the correct route, and a set of rules. If the message is a question about Globant Enterprise AI, it should respond with FAQ. If the message is a suggestion or comment, it should respond with feedback. And in any other case, it should respond with a no. Additionally, we tell it not to use any formatting in the response and not to use prior knowledge to try to answer the question. Let's test it out. I'm going to send a few messages to check each path. It seems to be working correctly, so let's move on to the FAQ RAG. For the FAQ RAG, we'll use the RAG solution we have in Globant Enterprise AI. Let's create a new RAG with the default settings, and we're going to set up a FAQ document about Globant Enterprise AI. Our RAG solution offers several types of configurations and support for different use cases. But in this example, we'll use the default configuration. Now let's move on to the feedback agent. This agent should collect user data to send suggestions or comments. In our example, the feedback agent will respond with a JSON, so we can parse this response, and in doing so, we'll take the opportunity to show you some functions we have in flows. The JSON data is as follows: a job title, a country, and the comment or suggestion. We also include a flag to determine if all the data has been collected, and a message for the user. For example, a message requesting missing data. Again, let's ask Iris to create it. If we look at the prompt, we once again specify a name, a purpose to collect comments and suggestions, and the response format must be JSON. We also include the rules for the flag that indicates whether all the data has been collected or not. Let's do a quick test. It seems to work, so let's move on to the next step. The last agent we'll create is a fallback agent to handle messages that are outside the scope of our flow. There's nothing special here. We're simply going to make sure it doesn't try to answer questions that are outside the scope of Globant Enterprise AI. All right, now let's create the multi-agent flow. Now that we have all the agents ready, let's create the flow. I'm going to create a new flow. Let's wait for it to initialize, and now we can edit it. First, we need to send all user messages to the orchestration agent and store the response in a variable. We add the agent node and disable the use as response option so we can store the response in a variable. Let's create the variable and disable the use as response option. Markdown handler to prevent the response content from being modified. Next, we're going to add a conditional to evaluate the content of the path variable. Let's create an expression for each path. On the FAQ path, we need to add a RAG assistant node configured to call the FAQ RAG. Finally, we add a goTo node, and that way we'll send the conversation back to the user input node to keep the conversation loop going. On the feedback path, we need to add the agent node configured to call the feedback agent. In the case of the feedback agent, we need to parse the response, which is a JSON. To do this, we'll assign all the JSON data to variables. Now we can add a message node to send the content of the message variable to the user. And then we can add a second conditional node to evaluate the variable. All data collected. Then we'll close the loop again to keep the conversation going. In our example, if we have all the necessary data, we can send it to a spreadsheet. I'm going to add a spreadsheet node and configure the variables I want to send. To set up the Google spreadsheet, check our documentation. You'll need a service account and to share the spreadsheet with editor permissions with that service account. Lastly, let's add the fallback agent on the else path of the first condition. Now we can test our flow and see how it behaves in the execution log. First, let's test the FAQ path with some questions. As we can see, the orchestrator directs the conversation down the correct path. Now, let's test the feedback path. We can see the values of the variables we set in the logs. Finally, let's ask a question outside the scope of our example to test the fallback agent. Now that our flow's ready, we can publish it on Slack and Teams. Flow offers built-in integrations with Slack and Teams that can be configured in the integration section. These integrations allow communication with these third-party services and also translate messages into the format expected by each service. For the integrations, you need to create an application in the Slack or Teams workspace and configure the appropriate webhooks. Once we've properly set up the channels following these guides, we'll be able to test the flow in Slack and Teams. Now let's test the flow in Slack. And now let's test the flow in Teams. Any changes made to the flow will affect all configured channels, making it easier to add new features and make corrections. With this demonstration, we saw how a single conversational experience can be used across multiple channels without losing consistency. By designing once and deploying everywhere, we reduce maintenance time, ensure consistency, and accelerate the adoption of artificial intelligence. I hope this session inspires you to rethink your conversational flows and bring AI to every channel in a unified and scalable way. Thank you very much for joining me.